pissed again?
Yeah.
He was actually caught to be pissed.
Shut up. My granddad and bent over in front of it.
Hey?
I can see what's being filmed. You turn it on and then just bend right over.
Make sure it's filmed, that's it. Okay. A quick word of warning, this is a story that
So gross.
it's got me a lot of fans, but it didn't go down very well at the last Bunkfest reading. There was a couple behind me who walked out in disgust purely because of some horrible words, but it's a comedy horror piece. Comedy horror! Come along, come along!
They walked in half as a room, and he was, and the kids been, they've been dragged out by the adults. That's hilarious.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Demon Seed. No children watching? Good, good.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a few.
The vibration was so severe it rattled the delicate teacups in their bone china saucers. The walls seemed to shiver and the pink tasseled uplights shook violently, throwing jerky shadows across the magnolia walls. Even the heavy wooden crucifix above the fireplace shook. Jane's mother's eyes narrowed, her lips pursed even tighter than Jane would have thought possible. A thin, bloodless line of disapproval. Jane nervously followed her mother's eyes upwards to the ceiling. Right above them was Paul's room. It was the headboard of the bed that was making the noise, banging rhythmically on the wall, accompanied by the sounds of teenage grunting and pleasure. Jane's eyes met her mother's briefly and then looked away. I would have expected young Paul to have grown out of that sort of thing. This was met by a snigger from Don. He grinned at the ceiling and then turned back to his newspaper. Both women turned to him. Jane's eyes widened, her expression saying, "Don't make this worse, you know what she's like." "Something amuses you, Donald," the mother said icily. "As the boy's father, it is your duty to curb him of such habits." Don folded the paper with a sigh and tossed it onto the coffee table. "Habits? Come on, Bridget. Boy's having a wank, that's all." The sudden intake of breath sounded like a snake's hiss. The old woman's thin cheeks coloured suddenly as if she'd been slapped. Don grinned wider, taking obvious pleasure in his mother-in-law's reaction. Jane sighed, shrank back into the sofa. Another battle's looming. "Not in my house, he isn't, and you will not use such filthy language in my presence." She edged closer to the table, hunched over the rattling crockery. A skeletal finger jabbed in his direction. "And remember, it is your fault that you are all here." A real man would have held on to his job, wouldn't have allowed his family to be thrown out of their bedroom. "Oh, come on, this is reception, you stupid old moose." Don's grin vanished, replaced with anger and stung male pride. "If you read the papers instead of that bloody voodoo spell book, you'd have some idea what's going on in the real world." Jane shrank back even further. Now he'd crossed the line. The vibrations were stronger now, the crucifix shaking violently on the hook, as though God himself were making his displeasure known. While above, the 15-year-old boy's own pleasure was all too obvious. "How dare you insult the Holy Bible in such a fashion? It is the word of God!" Bridget screeched. She turned sharply to her daughter, spittle flying from her lips. "This is his punishment, Jane. You disobeyed his will by marrying this wastrel and taking his feckless son into your own home." "Oh, come on. So she deserves to lose her own home," Don said. "Me getting the boot from the warehouse, then the bailiffs turn us out. That's God's will. Fuck's sake." Don stood up. His muscular bulk towered over her, the shaven hair on his scalp brushing against the low ceiling. Despite his size, in Jane's eyes he looked smaller than the diminutive, wasted frame of her seated mother. Bridget sat back calmly, her arms folded, unfazed by the aggressive stance of her son-in-law. "Of course it is. God hath delivered her unto me. Now I can undo the vile poison and corruption that festered in her soul. But only if she will listen to the word of God." Jane swallowed noisily, as Bridget's eyes swiveled in her direction and fixed her with a gloating smile, as if to say, "You will listen, and I'll do my best to turn you against your man and his son." That unspoken thought was picked up by Don. He may have been a manual worker, but he was no fool. "Don't even go there, bollock chops. You've ruined enough of her life. You ain't going to destroy her anymore. What do you reckon, Jane?" "Ah, fuck this." He strode to the door and pulled it open savagely. The door slammed shut behind him. "Off to the pub, I'll be bound," Bridget said knowingly. Jane didn't answer. And she couldn't blame Don. Right now, she felt like joining him. The echo of the slamming front door gave way to the repeated banging of the headboard above them. Flakes of plaster fell from the moulded cornice, and then the crucifix fell to the floor. It was a thick piled carpet, snow white, and yet the soft thud the wooden cross made as it landed sounded like the crack of doom. Christ lay face down, suffocated by a thick pipe. It had an explosive effect on Bridget. She shot to her feet and grabbed Jane's arm. The fingernails felt like nails piercing the soft fabric of a sweater, digging into her bicep. "Come with me!" Jane felt like she was 8 years old again, yet again being dragged up the stairs to her room with no supper for some imagined slight. Some innocent child's comment that had been taken the wrong way, interpreted as a slur against the Almighty. Bridget held the retrieved crucifix to her chest as she stormed up the stairs, dragging her child behind her. She mumbled humble entreaties to the carving, begging the Lord for forgiveness. A small rounded piece of fluff from the carpet transferred itself from the head of Christ to Bridget's lips. The banging and orgasmic cries were loud at each step. "The self-pollution will stop right now!" The piece of fluff remained, stuck to Bridget's moistened upper lip like a globule of cum. Despite herself, Jane started to laugh. Self-pollution? God, how ancient is that term? Don's right, my mum is still living in Dickens's times. She'd once caught Paul in his act of self-pleasure 3 months ago. She thought he was out with his friends as there was no noise blaring from the TV or the PS3 he usually played during the evenings. It had felt safe to go in, pick up the dirty clothes he left piled in a festering heap beside the bedside cabinet. The curtains had been drawn, the lights off. The only reason there had been no movement under the rumpled bedclothes was because her stepson had been frozen rigid, immobile with embarrassment at being caught. His small eyes looked like those of a cornered rat, beady, black and furtive in the dim light spilling in from the hallway. She had jumped in alarm as her duvet cover fell to the floor. Paul's nakedness was fully exposed, his thin frame with muscles yet to develop looking pasty and fragile in the hall light. But it was a swollen mass at his groin that had made her eyes bulge in disbelief and concern. The door to Paul's bedroom, her bedroom, so many years ago, was thrown inward. Her mother had decided not to bother with courtesy or consideration, certainly not with dark satanic acts committed in this house of piety. "Stop this ungodliness right now, young man!" The cum-like globule of carpet fluff flew from Bridget's lips, landed in Jane's eye. She blinked and pulled her arm free from her mother's iron grip. There was no resistance. Bridget's grip was loose, the slackened fingers falling away, almost as slack as the mouth, that gaped in disbelief at the sight that greeted them both. "Oh, don't know how juice, please."
That was different.
Jane had expected it to be a repeat of her discovery 3 months ago. Back in her former home, the walls had been thick and solid, and unlike the metal-sprung bedstead in this house, Paul's bed had been a divan with no headboard. Any sounds from a furiously masturbated boy were slight, to say the least. But the sight should have been the same. The swollen mass in Paul's groin had been grey and shapeless. Some rank-smelling fluid had seeped through the folds of the sack-like covering as it writhed and pulsated in the frantic teenager's hand. Jane remembered the unearthly sight of it sliding to the floor, fall into the folds of the duvet cover like a snake seeking shelter. What greeted Jane and Bridget now was completely different. The swollen mass wasn't in Paul's groin. It was Paul's groin. Back then, when a sack-like thing had fallen to the floor, Jane had been convinced it was still moving. The slimy, glistening fluid had seeped from the base like some awful form of the ectoplasm she'd seen flying around in the film Ghostbusters. It could have been worse, Jane, Don told her later. When I was a kid, I used to wank into a pair of my girlfriend's knickers. At least he used an old sock, didn't go rummaging through your drawers, so to speak. She had almost slapped him. Now she wished he was here. Perhaps he would make light of the terrifying scene in front of her. Or maybe not. His son wanking into an old sock was one thing. His son lying in bed with two huge, swollen glands that looked ready to burst was something else. Even Bridget was speechless. Both gonads were swollen to the size of rugby balls. No longer pink and hairy, but smooth and lobster red. The pubic hairs had burned away with the friction. But not just from friction burns caused by the frantic masturbation that still continued in front of the horrified women's gaze. Material covering the thin shaft of Paul's member was smouldering, the fibres crisping and blackening as it shot up and down in a rapid blur. The smell of burning fibres mingled with the stench of cremated hair, and a faint hint of something that reminded Jane of the undercooked pork her mother used to serve for Sunday lunch. Paul's bulging, terror-filled eyes met his stepmother's. His lips parted in a mute plea for help. Finally, Bridget spoke. Her hands no longer trembled. The hand that lifted the crucifix was firm and steady, full of purpose. The carving was pointed directly at Paul's testicles. Paul's testicles. There was a distance of a mere 3 feet between Paul's left gonad and the crown of thorns that pierced Christ's wooden head. See! Bridget shrieked. Behold the dread fate that awaits those who would self-pollute. Witness the abomination! Jane couldn't tear her horrified stare from the swollen testes. Blood vessels bulged under the skin like thick cords, even redder than the skin, and they writhed ceaselessly. I have to get it out of me! Paul's gasping words melted into a high-pitched scream. Bridget's response was less than sympathetic. Her eyes narrowed as she saw what was covering Paul's member. Is that my stole? Stole? Jane thought. What's she on about now? It is! The stole the Archbishop gave me when he visited my church last year. Your godless fosterlings wanking into it! Despite his agony, Paul heard the accusation and tried to respond. Couldn't help it. So silky.
He's not done before.
Bridget rounded on Jane, her eyes blazing. See, the demon that lurks within us all. Paul has given it a taste of freedom by self-abuse, by desecrating a holy vestment. See how it seeks entry into our world, birthing itself in a mockery of the Lord's gift of procreation. The swollen testicles heaved and pulsated. Go on, heave and pulsate. Waves of heat rolled over them, raising the temperature of the stuffy room. The blood vessels were almost solid. This was too much. Jane found her inner strength, clutched onto it, and dragged it from the bottom of her being. Demon? A taste of freedom? Don't be ridiculous, Mother. Paul's ill. He needs medical help. I'll phone for an ambulance. Then it's too late. The taste of freedom is not enough. It will hunger for more. The boils of Beelzebub must be lanced. The instrument of our Lord's suffering will be a holy weapon. Bridget kissed the top of Christ's head and advanced. The sharpened point of the crucifix pressed into the left gonad. From the beer garden, in a pub opposite Bridget's house, Don stood, speechless, at the sight of the thing that exploded from the upstairs window in a torrent of creamy fluid. His cigarette drooped from his dropping jaw, spilling ash down his shirt. His pint glass hit the cobbled ground, but the shattering of glass was masked by the wet thudding sound of the black and white object that landed on the empty road that separated the two buildings. It was motionless. It was also human. Don raised his eyes to the shattered bedroom it had flown, or rather been forced from. Shit, that's Paul's room. The sudden silence that fell over his fellow smokers in a beer garden was broken by a long female wail of horror coming from that room. Don pushed open the garden gate and ran into the road. As he got closer to the motionless form, he could see it wasn't his son. Relief gave way to bewilderment, confusion, and then fear. The broken, black-clad figure lying in a sticky pool of glistening slime and fragments of broken window glass was Bridget. It was female, so it had to be. That was Jane screaming upstairs, so what was on the ground was undoubtedly old Bollock Chops herself. But what the hell is that on her face? Then the smell hit him. He recoiled, gagging on the vomit. A stench of sulphur, burning meat, and something else. Now he knew what the gallons of sticky, milky, opaque slime that drenched his mother-in-law's lifeless body was. He thought back to the pounding sounds of his son's self-pleasure. No way. That can't all have come from one teenage kid. No way. Nothing on earth could have produced all that. He also knew what those scarlet, fleshy sacs covering Bridget's face were. And he knew where, or rather who, they'd come from. He looked back up to the bedroom window. Jane stood in full view, shaking uncontrollably, seemingly unaware of the ejaculate that covered her like an upturned bucket of wallpaper paste. She raised a trembling hand, her finger jerking as it pointed to the thing that lay in front of her husband. The smell was stronger now, the sulphurous undertones predominant. Nothing on earth, Don thought again, and stared in horror at the punctured scrotal sacs on Bridget's face. They rose, inflating like balloons, then deflated. Inflated again, and then deflated. Breathing, drawing life into the body. The body that now rose, getting to its feet with a sucking sound as the cum-sodden tarmac slowly released its prisoner. The stench of ejaculate and sulphur was a tangible physical thing that would have had Don vomiting once more if it hadn't been for the awful voice that thundered down the street. A terrifying voice that spoke from a different plane of existence. One that struck his whole body with so much fear, even the vomit froze in his stomach. Demon seed, it chuckled. Old Bollock Chops had a new voice. It licked the ejaculate from its lips with an impossibly large, forked tongue that was as black as night. It swallowed, grinned at Don, then spoke again. A taste of freedom. Juice, Slavy's Love Juice, power in this milk. Right. My fellow Lovecraftian has waited a full hour for this. Thanks for your name, sir. Mark. Nice to meet you, Mark. Cthulhu Fatagan.
Sorry to interrupt. Can I get my umbrella?
Yes, sorry.
Thank you. Oh my God. Thank you. Sorry.
It's hot in here, isn't it? It's ungodly temperature.
No, it's it was killing me. I have to go.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
See you again.
Okay.
Let's go.
Deliberately avoided you.
I say it sounds better.
6% remaining in 7 minutes. Can I do it? Yes, I can. This is, as I said earlier, False Light, which is a mashup of H.P. Lovecraft's Shadow over Innsmouth and
Get that on quickly.
yeah, quick.
Go on, quick.
No one knows.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
And Daphne du Maurier's Jamaica Inn. It's a rewriting of the wrecking scene. Do we have any Daphne du Maurier fans?
No.
Yes. We have any Lovecraft fans? Any more Lovecraft fans? Raise your hands.
No.
I'd love to say it.
I'm
That's
just
me,
going to
Bob.
say no anyway, Aid.
Very well.
Is there
No.
any Adrian Chamberlin fans? No, definitely not.
No, don't know who he is. Like yesterday, don't know who he is. Ain't got a clue.
That's why really. Foxtrot is a story that's done quite well. It's been reprinted twice. It's a very popular story. It's been printed on printed on the Lovecraft e-zine, which is a web page devoted to new Lovecraftian fiction, and it's been reprinted in this full Fathom 40, published by the British Fantasy Society, which also contains works by Graham Masterton, Kim Newman, Robert Schumann, Jasper Kent's, Conrad Williams and Ramsey Campbell. So to be in pages with these legends was a big boost for me. So, this is False Light. Crouched with his men behind the jagged rock that broke the expanse of the beach, Joss Merlin peered ahead into the mist-shrouded darkness. He knew it was pointless to listen for the vessel's approach. The breakers crashing onto the rocks in the bay drowned all sound, except for the retreating of the waves on the shingle. That latter noise sounded like the hissing of some great reptilian creature, hungering for fresh meat. Joss shivered at the thought. His throat was dry, and his eyes stung with the salt spray from the breakers. He felt the icy water soaking into his clothing just as his men did. But it was something else that chilled into his very soul. In all his years of wrecking on the Cornish coast, Joss Merlin had never known a night like this. And though he'd never admitted to his men, it scared him. This fog was no ordinary autumnal mist, he knew that. The full moon that had been shining so brightly earlier had vanished, as though God himself had plucked it from the sky. God, or somewhere else. "It ain't natural, Francis," he heard his younger brother Jem mutter to Francis Davy. Both men were crouched beside him behind the rock. He knew Jem was just as uncomfortable as he, but Davy, well, Francis Davy, the vicar of Altamont, was a different matter. "This father's devil sent," Jem continued, and Joss silently agreed with him. Davy didn't. "This mist is a boon to us all, Jem. It is proof that our Father provides." Joss shivered at the vicar's words. They sounded almost as reptilian as the waves retreating over the shingle. He kept his eyes dead ahead, not to see the approach of the vessel that Francis Davy had promised would come this very night, but to avoid the sight of the vicar's white skin and piercing red eyes. Even in this darkness, they seemed to glow with an inner luminescence. Just like one of those strange fish-like things Jem had seen landed along the coast last summer. Something that had no right to exist, that Francis Davy had claimed to have come from some unfathomed part of the ocean where sunlight never fell. Davy had taken it away, claiming it was proof that God's power was everywhere, even in the pitch darkness of the watery abyss. God alone knew where it was now. Joss shook his head and concentrated on the unsettling blend of white mist and pitch moonless night before him. For the only thing that scared him more than the fog this night was working alongside the albino, Francis Davy. Joss Merlin was a big man, almost 7 feet tall, with skin as dark as a gypsy's, the complete opposite of the albino vicar's. His huge frame and long arms contained a physical power that made all fear him and obey without question. Few would have believed that it was the Vicar of Altenham who was the mastermind behind this gang, who had wrecked countless vessels, murdered the mariners, and plundered their ships. They're afraid of me, the whole damn lot of them. Afraid of me, who's afraid of no man, Joss had said to Patience's daughter, who was now staying at his inn on Bodmin. A lie. Patience knew very well that her husband drank out of fear of what the priest ordered him to do. He'd almost damned himself, almost opened his mouth too far to Mary Yellen. I shut myself in my room and shout my secrets in my pillow. I've told you because I'm a little drunk and I can't hold my tongue. Thankfully, he was not too drunk. He'd caught himself inside. I'm not drunk enough to lose my head. I'm not drunk enough to tell you why I live in this godforsaken spot and why I'm the landlord of Jamaica Inn. All the same, he'd have to watch Mary Ellen very closely. That girl will be trouble, he was certain. Joss turned to his right and saw the dancing star in the darkness. He grunted in approval and relief, knowing soon it would begin. Because this was no star. It danced and swayed in the wind because it was a false light. A lantern, held aloft by one of his men on the highest part of the cliff that sloped to the sea. A beacon of lies and falsehood, one that promised deliverance from the ravages of the hungry sea, offered shelter and safety, and instead delivered only death. See, it comes! Francis Davey cackled in glee, pointing a skeletal finger to the new light dead ahead of him in the storm-tossed bay. This new pinprick of light did not dance like the false light on the cliff top. It dipped, remained hidden for a while, and then would rise above the blackness of the invisible breakers, as though clawing its way to heaven. Soon, the mast-light of the ship grew larger and closer to that on the cliff. One compelled the other, a moth summoned by a candle, and soon they would be a pair of shining red eyes in the mist. Here was the vessel that David had promised. This was the square-rigged brig Invoker. Joss Merlin held his breath as the rich vessel made contact with the treacherous rocks of the bay. Now the noise. The ear-piercing shriek of timber splintering, of square-rigged masts and spurs twisted and breaking. The triumphant roar of the sea, breakers crashing onto the deck and washing away those mariners that clung on for dear life to the slippery, sloping surface. His men waited for his signal. His huge arm was raised aloft, a bear's paw ready to strike. They stared quizzically at him, wondered why that arm trembled. It was a sight and a sound he had been used to since childhood, when he was first initiated into the art of the wrecker. The sound of a vessel dying, murdered by the sea, was always accompanied by the human screams of despair from the men on the ship. But this time, not one had screamed. Not one. The albino vicar stared at him and muttered angrily, "Why do you hesitate? Give the order!" His hand fell. As one, the men of the gang ran screaming like maniacs past the jagged rocks and waded waist deep into the breakers. For once, Joss Merlin stayed. Always the first to lead his men to the spoils of the sea like a victorious general. Always the first to bring his club crashing down on the head of the first mariner thrown onto the beach. This time, he remained behind the rock. "Not joining your men, Joss?" The vicar's words were delivered in a suspicious tone. Joss watched his team snatching at the bopping wreckage amongst the breakers. The crates were miraculously intact. Wooden boxes that had survived the destruction of the rocks and were landed unharmed and whole on the shingle. "What is the Invoker's cargo, Francis?" This was not tobacco. This was not the silk nor the brandy Davy had promised. Those crates contained something else. The love of our Father, the vicar said with a smile. Joss turned and stared, and saw that the albino wasn't smiling at him, but at the actions of the wreckers. The sailors of the Imbocker had been brought to them on the waves. The clubs of the wreckers raised brought down a devastating force that was almost equal to that of the sea that had destroyed the brig. For a while, Joss saw nothing but the fury and joy of his men as they wiped out the survivors of the wreck, the witnesses of their crime. And then, Joss started, saw the baffled expressions of his men. No blood splattered their sodden clothing. No red fluid had dripped from their clubs. Joss moved from the shelf of the rock and back into the bay. The mist was fading now, the icy chill of the autumn night fading as dawn cast a weak light upon the carnage of the bay. Joss Merlin stared in horror at the crushed and pounded skulls of the things that had crewed the Imbocker. These were human in shape only. They had 2 arms, 2 legs, a thickened torso. But that torso was bent forwards, so that these unholy things would only be able to walk in a hunched fashion, their webbed fingers dragging along the deck of the ship they sailed. The sun rose, the light stronger. It reflected off their green scales, made them shine like emeralds. On the one nearest to him, 3 slits on each side of its neck opened, flared in unison, like a trio of identical wings, sucking in a last shuddering breath of air before the gills relaxed and the creature died. Now Joss Merlin was glad that the head had been caved in and pounded to a pulp. At least he would be spared the obscene reality of what visage this ungodly creature possessed, what its eyes would look like when they stared, cold, dead and unblinking at him. The wreckers stood in the retreating breakers, their horrified expressions replacing puzzlement and bewilderment as dawn's golden light revealed to them the nature of their victims. Joss turned stiffly to the man who had the answers, the man of God. But Francis Davy was oblivious to the hostile stares fixed on him from the men in the sea. He was hunched over the first of the crates, his fingers pulling the planking free from the nails with an unnatural strength. He muttered as he threw the wood to one side, pulling with shaking hands at the shrouded items within. Cthulhu Fatagan, Cthulhu Fatagan, Cthulhu Fatagan. Joss heard splashing sounds behind him, then a thudding of booted feet on the sand. Jem grabbed his shoulder. I said 'twasn't natural, Joss. These be devils. Nay, his older brother replied. No, the real devil lurks yonder, calls himself a man of God. Now Davy had pulled free the shrouds covering the figures. He held aloft the first golden image of something that looked like an octopus or a squid, but no cephalopod that Joss Merlin or any of the wrecking crew had ever seen. No natural creature could have that amount of teeth. The light bouncing off it was strange. It didn't gleam the way gold should. It was almost as though the golden statue was soaking the November sunlight and then throwing it back, corrupted, unnatural. A false light. A light that imparted a strange glow to the albino's sickly white skin, his eyes burning like the polished and faceted rubies embedded in the face of the statue. And the chilling, beatific smile that broke out on Francis Davy's face was something Joss Merlin never wanted to see again. He made sure of it. Take him! He screamed, his shaking paw of a hand trembling with as much fear as hatred. As his men hurried to obey, he turned back to the flotsam and jetsam on the beach, grunted in satisfaction at the sight of the coils of rope spilling from one of the brig's crates. He grabbed one, fighting the urge to drop it in revulsion at its slimy texture. He strode along the strand towards the 3 spars that had been flung far from the body of the wreck, forming a natural A-frame in the sand. He smiled grimly as he formed a loop at one end of the slimy rope. Within moments, he had fashioned a crude but serviceable noose. The wreckers dragged the screaming albino over to the makeshift gallows. Joss smiled when he saw that Davy still had the gold statue of that octopus-like thing in his hands. His fingers were rigid, fixed around the wings that sprouted from the flurry of tentacles on the creature's back, as though he was determined to take it to the grave with him. That could be arranged, Joss thought grimly. So far, Francis. You've gone too far. You brought the devil himself upon us. But we'll not kill for the Dark One, nor his foul gold. The noose was tightened around the albino's neck. Even now, watching the other end tossed over the makeshift gallows and knowing what would happen, he still would not relinquish his hold on the statue. Joss himself pulled on the other end of the rope, his huge bulk and strength making assistance from his men unnecessary. When Davy was hoisted a clear 5 feet in the air, Joss tied the rope around the lower spar and stood back to watch the vicar die. The wreckers all watched in grim satisfaction for a full 7 minutes. That was how long it took for the albino's legs to stop kicking, for his writhing to slow and cease. And all this time, even though the spars creaked and protested, they remained firm and true, a solid gallows. The light from the autumn sun rose stronger and brighter with each moment that passed. Davy's body slumped, but still his hands remained rigid around the gold statue. He'll take that to hell with him, Jim muttered. Joss nodded in silent agreement. Then he turned to his crew. Behind them the tide continued to batter the remnants of the Imboka. The shrouds unfurled from the spars and moved across the shattered hull of the brig, as though trying to hide the corpse of the vessel from the accusing glare of daylight. What now, Joss? John Gerald, the man who had raised the false light on the cliff top, stared at him with searching eyes. Do we take this accursed gold? Nay, leave it where it lays, Joss answered. Let the sea take it, and him. He turned and walked along the shoreline, stepping past the open crate, fighting a temptation to look within. There were things inside that glowed with that same hideous, unnatural light emitted by Davy's carving. Soon the tide would roll in and reclaim it, he told himself. Banish it to the depth from whence it came, forever dim its false light. At least now they were free from Davy. Now he, Joss Merlin, was the true master of the wreckers. He smiled in anticipation of a celebratory drop of brandy in Jamaica Inn. The wind stiffened, swaying the body of Francis Davy. The rope stretched with its weight, the spars bowing, and finally collapsing. Joss Merlin's men halted and turned to stare. Then they turned back, grinned at their true master, and ran on to join him. The albino vicar landed face down, his dead hands pressing the icon firmly into his chest. An icon, an article of faith. For it was faith that had sustained Francis Davy, the albino priest of Altanum, all his life. Through the bullying he had suffered in his younger days, the revulsion he had seen on the faces of women, and the contempt that had driven him to the church, and to find that even God had no answer for him. Then he found a new faith, a promise of life eternal, a life he knew the Christian God could not provide. The noose unraveled. The green tentacle that Joss Merlin had taken for slime-encased rope slipped from the albino's neck. And now it burrowed under the sand like a worm, seeking the light from the buried gold icon that still burned brightly in the darkness caused by Davy's body. Francis Davy jerked several times as the tentacle did its work. Then his eyes opened, burning brightly red with the same intensity as those rubies in the gold icon. He got to his feet and looked down at the sand. The icon and tentacle had gone, but he smiled, knowing they hadn't really disappeared. He stroked the sharp-edged bulge in his abdomen and stared at the welcoming darkness of the ocean and the light beyond that beckoned him. Light that only he could see, shining brightly from the depths of the ocean. He stared at the sickly yellow disk in the sky and sneered. "False light," he spat and made his way to the sea. Not wrong now, dear. Oh, I thought I'd been kicked out of someone better.
Glasses, honey. Do you want me to stop this, eh?
Yeah, please.
I had to move it, you saw that.